All right, welcome to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donnie, and I want to thank you all for being here for tonight's question and answer with Professor David McQueen. Professor McQueen, how's the crime fighting life these days?
Oh, I tell you, Superman, I was so troubled to go to my comic book collection and find out that you were dead. You appear to be alive now, but
Alive and well.
I've answered the bat signal, and I'm ready here in the back cave to have a few minutes of fun. But wait, where is George? Oh, George is on vacation. And when you look at this in the future, George, know that you're missed.
Yes. Unfortunately, we don't have Robin here tonight with us, but we've got Batman, we've got Alfred, and I'm glad that you took up the bat signal, the call, Professor McQueen, because we've got a ton of questions for you, as always.
Good.
I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Let's introduce our class to our style tonight. Because you have requested it, this is going to be question and answers. Donnie and I are going to limit our answers to 10 minutes. And so that means we have 6 per hour. Donnie is going to take the first question. He's going to take the question at the 1 hour break, and he'll take the final question. The 9 other questions will fit in between all of that. And what we are thinking about doing that would be fun is doing a classroom lottery where you students next week can send to Donnie which one of these questions you would like to see expanded from 10 minutes to 2 hours. And we will respond in that way. Good idea, huh, Donnie?
I like it. Great idea. As you know, Professor McQueen, we always get a ton of questions that come in. And I've already got questions saved from previous shows that have come in, plus videos from critics that I've watched in terms of just kind of seeing what, their best possible objections are. So
okay,
I will be dealing with those.
I will be your checker. I want to set my timer for 10 minutes. You take the first question.
Okay. Actually, before you put that timer on, let me give a couple reminders, Professor McQueen, since we have you here. I want to remind everybody that we've got a couple debates with you in the next couple months. We got one next month. First thing, the Cambrian explosion, Professor McQueen and Jackson Rowe, best explained by creation or evolution. So that's going to be a ton of fun, as well as Professor McQueen versus Taylor. Snake was right. The Great Age of the Earth debate. And then the following month, we are working on setting you up with another debate with someone named Jason Torm.
Oh, this is so much fun. I'm looking forward to this.
All right, well, let's get right into it, Professor McQueen. Let me remind everybody in the audience, please tag me with your questions at Standing for Truth. That way I don't miss your question. Actually, I see questions coming in already. So why don't we let's start it off with this one. So we got a super chat here from Virum Argumentum. I appreciate the super chat and the guys. You're the life and blood of this channel. So let's get this party started, Professor McQueen. So first question is, Walton, John Walton, I believe, says some giants survived the flood, according to Genesis 6:4. And that proves the flood was local. What are your thoughts on this, David? And what's the best way to respond?
I'll let you read Genesis 6:4 in a minute. I'll begin the response and then you can finish, okay?
Sure. Sounds good.
So you go ahead and look up Genesis 6:4. And let's keep in mind the overall framework of the book of Genesis. Genesis 1 through 4 covers the Garden of Eden, which was a real place with 2 real people. I actually have them here. I didn't know that were you aware that I'd actually found Adam and Eve Yeah, in my children's toy box.
That's where they've been all this
grandchildren.
time.
I think Eve was actually a redhead like Ms. McQueen, but I won't debate that. The point is, first 4 chapters deals with Adam and Eve and their problems. And then 5 is a chronology. 6, 7, and 8 is the flood. And so my first response is some giants survived the flood according to 6:4. No, not at all. 6:4 is before the flood. Could you read it for us, my friend?
Absolutely. So we got it right here.
6:4.
Excuse me. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. So I think this is where their argument is, Professor McQueen, is if there were giants in the earth before the flood, and then we had the flood, which we would say is worldwide, which would have destroyed all flesh, of course.
Right.
Not considering Noah, his wife, 3 sons, and their wives.
Yes.
And also after that. So how could there be giants after the flood if supposedly all flesh was wiped out? When the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men.
Right.
Which were
so, Donnie, you're actually best suited for the biological side of this argument. I'll start it. We've got 7 minutes left on this question. So I'll start it and then you finish it. Let's think through this. Creationists in the last 10 years have been very careful to correct the error of racism. And on some of my presentations, you've heard me say that the Darwinian viewpoint is a racist viewpoint. Now, why do I say that? Everybody calls it the origin of species, but they don't read the full title. The full title includes the word favored races. You need to go back and read Darwin's own writings in this regard. Darwin himself believed that man evolved from pre-human ancestors. Now, keep in mind that in Darwin's mind, these pre-human ancestors were not what is being taught of in our neo-Darwinism. Darwin, when he thought about these pre-human ancestors, he figured that they had come through the line of dinosaurs and been built up and up and up, so that in Darwin's day, he thought of mankind evolving from aboriginals, apes, and monkeys, which we clearly know is not true. Now, how does that tie into the answer to this question? It ties in this way. The 8 people that got on board the ark got off the ark. And God he must have placed in those 8 people all the genetic potential. Now, I'll put Noah and his wife to one side for a moment, and let's talk about Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives. As many of my friends have thought about writing books about the pre-flood world, they have imagined what Shem, Ham, and Japheth might have looked like. Well, let's focus on the 3 women. The 3 women, were they to appear right behind me in my studio kitchen here, they would not be probably redheads. They would not be blonde-haired girls. They would probably not be obviously American Indian. They probably would not appear to be obviously Africans like I fell in love with when I went to Zimbabwe, old Rhodesia, in 2018 and 2019. What would they appear like? Well, if you know the actress Angelina Jolie, Donnie, do you know what she looks like? Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, you know, right off the bat, what's her ethnicity? Oh, well, I don't know. She's obviously got a mom and dad, but she looks like a little bit Asian and a little bit this, a little bit that. And so the three wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth were obviously filled with the gene pool. So as their descendants came, the different national groups of predominantly dark skinned, predominantly white skinned, redheads, Celtic, fair skinned people, they came. But how does it answer the question? It answers it this way. The genetic potential for having 7-foot tall people is there. How do we know? Donnie, are you aware that I'm initiating a suit against the National Basketball Association, the NBA? There are a few Scots like me playing in the NBA. Why? Because a lot of these people with a lot of melatonin in their skin are 7 or 8 feet tall. So you're trying to tell me there's no propensity, there's no potential for very tall people after the flood? What do you think of that answer, my friend?
Absolutely. I think that's a great answer. I've heard this argument numerous times in debates. Actually, we hosted a local flood debate recently, and that was one of the local flood proponents' main arguments. So to me, and they'll look to Numbers 13, where we read about the giants in those days, right, after the flood.
Exactly.
Well, that doesn't mean that it's the same giants that were pre-flood. I mean, we had giants pre-flood and giants post-flood, really big people. So, and yeah, it's not also a problem for the flood.
Our class should Google giants, and you will find clearly that there are people that appeared in the Ripley's Believe It or Not traveling show and circuses that were incredibly large people, 7, 8 feet tall. And these were people that were widely paraded around the country in the pre-World War II time. After World War II, and certainly in the 50s and 60s, as people became more sensitive to making fun of fat people and making fun of tall people and making fun of dwarfs, these went away.
All right. Well, great response, Professor McQueen. I've got a ton of questions coming in, so let's get right to the next one. So this one comes in from Chris Peacock. So he says, and I want to thank Chris for the question for the professor. So he says, a lot of young Earth creationists say folded / bent rock layers were soft when formed. As a professional geologist, what are your thoughts on this? And then he says nonsense. So he thinks this is a bad argument. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. People like Tim Clary. Donnie, would you mind pulling the book off the shelf behind you and show the audience Clary's book? You should buy this book. It's an expensive book, but it's an important book. And now we'll take one of Clary's ideas. And here is the Play-Doh that I'm so fond of, that I have. Let me reset my 10 minutes here so I can keep track of that. And so our argument has been that when you see folds in rocks that look like this, and these folds are common in every mountain chain on every continent, so they're not the exception to the rule, they're the rule. You must realize that when we talk about that, we can't be talking about a rigid object like my cell phone that has been put under pressure for millions of years, and that pressure somehow allows that rigid rock to fold. I would recommend to you, and I'll write it down here for you so you can see this. I would recommend that you go to a publication of Dr. John Morris. He's Dr. Henry Morris's son, and he is alive and well in Texas. And go to John Morris in the International Conference on Creationism proceedings and look up this reference on the internet. That's the International Conference on Creationism. I have a paper in the 1986 volume. My memory is that John's paper was after that. And in the paper, he points out a very important detail. If you look as a geological engineer at the rock mechanics of what's going on, and Chris, one question at a time, my friend. So if you look at the rock mechanics of rocks, what you find is this. Let me get a sheet of paper to illustrate this. Go down through my notes here. John Morris holds a PhD in geological engineering from some school in Oklahoma. As a Tennessee graduate, I don't like to think much about Oklahoma, but he has a PhD from there. And when you look at engineering geology parameters like YUNG, Young's modulus, MODULUS, when you look at these parameters like Young's modulus, and you look at the what's called the shear strength of rocks, if you look at these two parameters, it turns out, and I need a big red color to make it clear to the questioner just how wrong he is in his thinking. When you look at those things, they put an X through the traditional evolutionary geology view that over millions of years, you can fold a cell phone into an anticline or a syncline. We realize as we go through this that we are introducing vocabulary that you may not know, like anticline and syncline. So let me teach it to you using the Play-Doh here. A rock that's bent up like an arch, that's called an anticline. A rock that looks like a smiley face is a syncline. There are places that you can go in the Grand Canyon. Let me get to another sheet of paper here. There are places that you can go to in the Grand Canyon. Over the years, the prominent flood geologists, people like John Morris, Andrew Snelling, I myself in the mid-'80s hiked the canyon 5 times in 4 years. These other men have gone places I've never been. I was focused on the South Rim, but they have gone places in the Grand Canyon where you can see rocks folded like this. Now, class, remember how I draw diagrams? I have to put the surface here and then a tree for you to understand that this is a cross section. And so when you look at these synclines anticlines and synclines. Can you see how the word is used? The syncline is a smiley face. The anticline looks like an arch, A for arch. When you look at these have an axis through them. So I've got 4 minutes left here. Let's see what I can do. These have got an axis through them. And so the red lines are the axis of these folds. It turns out that in experiments I have done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I've been able to use the child's modeling clay, Play-Doh. I was able in the 60s to calculate its Young's modulus and shear strength. And then in the 70s and 80s, I was able to use that material to reproduce folds that I had seen in my undergraduate days in Tennessee, folds that I have seen in my field work in Germany in the 21st century, folds I've seen in my field work in Israel, Peru in 97. And so I've seen with my own eyes numerous units that could only have been folded while soft. Now, did these rocks remain soft in all the time after the time of the Great Flood? No, they hardened just as Play-Doh will naturally harden if left out. And so don't misunderstand the comment. Don't misunderstand the exact nature of the comment that the critic had. You know, the very idea of portraying us, and I'll use Play-Doh as an example here. Imagine this to be a mountain. And he's trying to argue that, okay, as that mountain's building, pieces of it will just, because it's so soft, will slough off. And if there are other units, what can I use as another unit here? Here. If there are other units deposited on top of it, it'll crush it down. This is a silly argument that doesn't stand up either to field work or to logic. Now, you'll notice what I have on here tonight. I've got my ever-present Batman joking thing, but it's time to stop joking. But I have my geologist hand lens, 2 different kinds that are symbolic of a field geologist like me. I've been using these actually for 55 years. And I'm here to tell you, as my time runs out, that there is no conflict between soft rocks producing anticlines and synclines like this versus the false evolutionary view. Okay, Donnie, let's go on to the next one.
All right, I appreciate that, Professor McQueen. So this next question comes in fantastic answer, and a few follow-up questions to that, but maybe we'll get to those a little bit later because we have so many questions coming in, a great diversity of questions. So this one comes in from the Science Ultimatum with Jason Torn. So Jason Torn, thank you for the question. We are in the works. We are working currently at setting up a debate between Jason and Professor McQueen, so that should be fun. So this question for you, Professor McQueen, is how would Mr. McQueen explain the intact nature of coral reefs and our dating of large reefs as much older than 6,000 years?
Okay. Jason, I appreciate that. I'm resetting my timer for 10 minutes here. And we will go through this argument. This argument has been around since World War II. My former boss, Dr. Henry Morris, faced this years ago World War II was almost 80 years ago now. So, this question's been around for a long time. And so let's go to George, who can't be here because of vacation. His favorite continent is Australia. When I'm drawing a map view, I always put a north arrow. So this is north. And on the eastern side of Australia is a very famous reef. Donnie, let's play Jeopardy. What's the name of that famous reef that's on the east side of Australia? That would be the Great Barrier Reef. Great Barrier Reef is something that Dr. Gary Parker, Ken Ham have seen with their own eyes. I've yet to see this reef, but I have seen fossil reefs in the Appalachian Mountains. And these reefs come in two flavors, like ice cream. They are stromatolitic reefs from the past. My mentor, Lynn Harris, wrote a paper about these. The one that I've got my hand on here is called an SHV reef, and the one I've got my hand on here is called an LLH. These are found in the Cambro Ordovician of East Tennessee, what Tim Clary would refer to as the Salk sequence. Now, the question that has been posed for 80 years is, how in the world that how in the world can a reef that we see grow very slowly in the Caribbean or on the east coast of Australia, how can we imagine a reef like that growing in a 6,000-year-old Earth? Well, let me respond to that in two ways, with two comments. The first one is this. Noah's flood was worldwide. Noah's flood was catastrophic, and the overall event lasted 12 months. I have, in my flood model, divided it into parts that I call flood phase 1, flood phase 2, and flood phase 3. Flood phase 1 is 40 days and 40 nights. Flood phase 2 is 5 months. And flood phase 3 is 6 months. During flood phase 1, as there was one supercontinent, which began to break apart during the time of the flood, as that began to break apart and the floodwaters descended and eroded, I would argue that some of the Western USA reefs that have been repeatedly used as fossil evidence for, oh, this can't be. These Western U.S. reefs were transported in mass, and I'll put a tree here just to illustrate that this is a cross section, that these thick bodies of reef were transported in mass, probably in flood phase 2, after they had been partially eroded during the first phase of the flood. And then they were buried in the latter part of the flood. So there are places in the Western U.S. that my colleague Steve Austin spent a lot of time studying in what I would guess would be the 1960s and 70s. But in the Western U.S., we can take you to a place where there's quite a prominent a topographic feature, and I'll put a tree there, and my friend and colleague Steve Austin standing to one side here. not to scale, obviously, but you can go to this area in the Western United States and you can see this reef. And our critics will say, oh, when you walk up to that reef and you actually look at it with your hand lens and study it in great detail, there's no way that that could have been produced in 6,000 years. To which the French would say, au contraire. Our argument is that the present is not the key to the past. Our argument is that the evolutionary viewpoint that everything we see happened very slow and long ago, that's not true. The real truth, when we look at the data of geology, is that what we're seeing happened very fast in the recent past. Dr. Gary Parker is retired in Florida. When you watch this, you'll realize I stole that from one of your books. And so how would we then argue this outcropping in the Western United States? Well, we would argue it this way. We would say that in these phases of the flood, the people that might have been escaping the flood would have been swept away and buried very deeply in sedimentary basins. That's why you don't routinely find human fossils associated with dinosaurs and so forth, ecological zonation. But in that case, Brother Steve would be swept away to a deep basin, never to be seen again. And then on top of him, let me get another color. We would argue that in the receding part of the flood, that last 6 months, that as the flood waters went down, they buried this outcropping with other rocks that would be illustrated by the colors that you see in the chart behind me here, the blues and the pinks and so forth. The rocks that would be carbonates that are illustrated on this map by the pink color would have been buried by rocks that would be illustrated by the yellow and tan colors that you see there. But then the story gets even better. Then what happens? What happens here? As the flood waters recede, they then eradicate, that's the wrong word. They erode these rocks above, and they go the same way as my friend Steve Austin would have gone. So they get eroded away so that the present topography looks like the mesa that I drove there with the tree on top. When George gets back, I'll have him put on a post data that he has gathered from reefs worldwide, which shows that even modern reefs, under certain conditions, can produce very rapid growth. In the second hour, I'm going to answer a question that I know that you have about the formation of limestone. And during that time, I'm going to take my new friend. My family doctor has encouraged me to drink 7 500 milliliter bottles of water per day. I don't think I can do it, Donnie. I might be able to do it. But my mind's been on water quite a bit. If I go over and open up my water bottle, I hope my urologist is watching. I'm hydrating. But if I go over here and I put some salt in this water, and then I go and I say, well, I want that water to be more acidic. So I get apple cider vinegar, which is acidic, and I pour that into my bottle. What am I doing? I am modifying the chemistry of the water. And in modifying that chemistry, we can change the growth rate of coral reefs. You think that's an adequate 10 minutes there, Brother Donnie?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was another thorough, fantastic answer. And I'm sure Jason might have some follow-up questions, but since we are working at setting up a debate between you two highly
That'll be
educated
good.
and knowledgeable
And by
individuals.
the way, before you go to the next question, I actually looked up what the 100 Chinese yen is. That's only $16. George and I insist that you boost it to maybe 200 Chinese yen next year. Okay, what's my next question there, my friend?
Jason says thank you for the answer. And yes, you and George, Professor McQueen, you guys deserve that raise. We've been talking about
Yeah,
it for a while now. So
16 times 2 is such a large number, I can't even do it in my head.
okay, so job well done. And now I am looking again for that super chat. Okay, we got a ton of questions here. I want to make sure I get to the super chats though.
Good.
First, so Kevin's biblical discussions. $5 super chat. I appreciate the support, Kevin. You guys are the life and blood of this channel, and you guys are the reason why we're able to do this full time. So he's got a question for you, Professor McQueen. He asks, how did Noah filter out the air on the ark?
Okay. Brother Jason, I am clicking my 10-minute timer here, and we will go through that. Now, in the period from 1980 to 2004, I was privileged to lead tours of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. I was thrown out of the Smithsonian in 2004 for reading the Bible in public, but that's a story for another time. I put together a group of cards, which I could carry in my suit coat, that would answer questions about the ark and minerals and so forth. And so let's review Genesis 6:14. And Donnie, if you could look that passage up, I'll have you read it here in a minute. In Genesis chapter 6, we get the specifications of the ark. There is some kind of wood that's used to build the rock. It's got the ark. The ark, it's got rooms in it. It's coated with pitch. But notice this. It's 450 feet long, 75 feet on the beam, and 45 feet high. But listen to this. The roof has got an 18-inch perimeter sky opening at the eaves. It's got 3 decks and 1 door. So, Donnie, you prepared to read that 6:14 for us?
Absolutely. So, Genesis 6:14. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch.
Take another sip of liquid and then read 15 and 16 for us.
15 and
I will do the same.
Okay. Let me expand this here. Okay. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it.
Now, I very much appreciate my colleague reading from the King James. And because we think of you as students, the 3 of us, Donnie, me, and George, we want you to start always with the King James and then go forward. And so the way that we go forward for our discussion here is to convert the cubits to feet. And as we have told you before, there is an ongoing argument as to what the proper length of a cubit is. Because I want to make my case hard in a debate, I'm going to choose the smallest arc. And so the smallest arc that we can draw here looks like a 2x4. I need to cut one. Remind me to do this, Brother Donnie, before our next time. It's a 2x4 looking object, but notice the dimensions. It's 450 feet long. Do I recall you play soccer in Canada, Donnie?
Yeah, well, I don't personally really play soccer, but we do
soccer
play
is
soccer in Canada.
Is it called a soccer field or a soccer pitch?
Soccer field.
See, this is longer than a soccer field from goal to goal. Notice that it is 45 feet tall. Now, my undergraduate minor was math. And so if I divide 45 and 450, that's a 1-to-10 ratio, isn't it? And it turns out that gives tremendous stability. That's a ratio of 1-to-10. But to answer this question about filtering out the air, we've got to go to the third dimension, and that is what's called the beam. If you look at the front of a ship, the beam of the arc was 75 feet. And that is this dimension between the arrows. Now, the very important detail that was read from the last verse that he read had to do with an object that has been depicted and argued about for years, and that is this red object at the top of the ark. Now, the door of the ark was never intended to be closed by man. God closed it. Why? Because the ark is a symbol of salvation. So God closed the ark, but also he finished it off when the ark landed after a year. He opened it back. So it was never intended to be open. What in the ark was intended to be open? Well, it turns out it was this red area at the top. And our critics have said, oh, you could never get air circulation in an area like that. Well, let's put this here and notice that is 18 inches, that dimension there. And so let me get the handy yardstick here. And oh, I'm so glad it's got centimeters on it too. So it's 18 inches. So let's use my head as an example. Could Noah have put his head out? Yeah, that's 18 inches. Now let me curve. That's 45 centimeters for those of you metric people. And so I'll grasp it at 18 inches. Could he have put his head out? Oh, yes, he could. Now, what if Noah was smart enough to build a vessel over the decades that could withstand a flood that no one had ever seen? Is it possible that the Creator God could have told the man, hey, Noah, why don't we do this? You're going to need some fresh air in the ark because some of the non-hibernating creatures are going to be having bowel movements and so forth. The modern viewpoint is that Noah and his sons could easily have rigged up a system where all that manure went down to the bottom of the ark. Donnie, I took one of my children's toys. At least in the U.S., this is called a commode, is it? Is that what it's called where you live? And in the commode goes, it goes the manure of evolution. But notice what my children's thing will do. What's this? It flushes. So we're going to flush all this evolutionary stuff. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Let's flush it down the toilet. Oh, there it went. Now,
where it belongs, Professor
stand,
McQueen.
I can't stand not trying to be humorous. But I've only got a minute left here, so I got to cut the humor. So if you imagine this louvered area at the top, where if you looked at these louvers from the side, from the outside of the ark looking down, see how to draw that. Draw it a little bit like this maybe. These louvered areas would actually be visible as, how to draw it. Well, I'll illustrate it. I won't draw it. Imagine this drumstick to be that louver there. I mean, the 18-inch thing. When Noah wanted fresh air, he could louver those out. And so it would look like that, you see, and the fresh air would come in. So the counter argument is always, well, McQueen, you all are saying that there were tsunamis, and you were saying that it rained. Well, let's keep in mind, you got to be careful here. It did rain. The most intense rain was the first 40 days and 40 nights, according to my model. And it did rain, the fountains of the great deep and so forth, for the next 5 months. But don't you think there could have been a 24-hour period where Noah's timer went off and he said to Shem, go up and open up the louvers. Let's get some fresh air. Okay, that 10 minutes is up. And we're down to the last 10 minutes. So I'll take one more question and then turn it over to you, Brother Donnie.
All right, here we go. So we've got a lot of questions, Professor McQueen. So this is good. And I want to remind the audience that we're just going to take a little break after this question. Then we'll be back for the second hour to answer more questions. And we are planning on doing more of these audience Q&As for 2022. So we want to do them a lot more.
You know, if this is popular enough, Donnie, you think we should do one of these a month?
Definitely.
Do one a month. Okay, go ahead with the next question, my friend.
Okay, so let's move on to this question that I have here. And this is a common objection that I see over and over again, even though we've addressed it and refuted it. Just recently, there was a video, I think it was titled something like, top 5 reasons why young Earth creation is false or impossible or something.
Oh, that's Erica, the poor gibbon that's been hit in the belly. I watched that video. Which one were you thinking of there?
So there were several, and this one popped up again. So I thought, you know what? Let's address this one from the good old Gutsy Gibbon here. And the question here is, I'll summarize the argument, okay, Professor McQueen? So evolutionists will say that all of our fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, and oil are all formed by geologic processes. And because of this, a process called basin modeling, which also involves radiometric dating, and the assumption that radiometric dating works. So essentially the question is this, Professor McQueen: does finding natural gas and these other things I mentioned require deep time?
Okay, it's interesting how the Holy Spirit leads me as I prepare each week. Here is an oil and gas map. Let me get the top of this so you can read it. This is an oil and gas map of all the fields in Louisiana. Let me pick one that I am close to. I hope you can see a large orange basin. Now, this is a map with north at the top, but this is the outline of a basin called the Monroe Field. And I live a 1-hour drive from this field. The Monroe Field extends over to a community called Delhi, which is on this map in green. You see what looks like a green arrow there, Donnie, near that orange? That's the
Yes.
Delhi field. That's an hour to the east of me. The other's an hour to the west. I was fortunate enough to be given some stratigraphic charts by a colleague of mine who had been a geologist. His name is Harry Stone. He's gone to be with the Lord now, but Brother Harry gave me some stratigraphic columns for this basin. And so this is actually something that I know about as a geologist. If you want to learn the basics of this, Erica, you need to pull up. Did you ever make the graphic about this, Donnie? About the impact article number 155? It's not important because I've got it right here. This is an essay that I wrote back in the 1980s that deals with the chemistry of oil explained by flood geology. It has some of the answers that you need, Erica. But let's go to this whole business of the value of radiometric dating when it comes to basins. Okay. Now, I've mentioned two basins here in Louisiana. One of them is the Monroe gas field, and the other one, the Monroe oil field, and then the Delhi gas field. And this is to the west of me, and this is to the east of me. Erica, I want you to go to your petroleum geologist buddies that seem to feed you this information and ask them for $100,000. They'll get it back. I have some data that I have compiled in this Delhi field that would allow me, should your buddies give me the $100,000, to build what's called a wildcat well, or drill a wildcat well in this Delhi field. And I would drill it on the basis of flood geology stratigraphy. What? You mean that you don't need to know what it says on the geologic map here? This is Jackson, Mississippi, and this is where I live. Whoops. Got to move it where you can see it. Oh, well. These rocks over here are supposed to be, well, this is easily detachable. So these rocks over here to the west of where I live, they are supposed to be tertiary, quaternary, but they go down to the upper Cretaceous. And that's what's buried in the subsurface. And so, did I figure this out by saying, oh, wait a minute, the Cretaceous is so many years old? No, I didn't figure it out. I used the same criterion that Tim Clary used. This is an article from December of 2021. And this diagram is repeated in the book that Donnie has there about the basin. That basin that you see in yellow and red there is offshore Louisiana. And you can see the peninsula of Florida there. And that basin is so important, and it's the kind of thinking that I did. Let me read you what Dr. Clary says here. One of the most spectacular examples of offshore Tejas deposits. Now, remember, sequence stratigraphy starts with Salk and goes up through Zuni and so forth, Tejas, Absarica, all words are used. This is the Tejas sequence stratigraphy group. Recent discoveries by oil company exploration. What? You mean the oil company is not looking for oil and gas using radiometric dates? No, they're looking for structures and chemistry. Let me keep on reading. Recent discoveries by oil company exploration have confirmed that the Whopper sand extends across 40,000 square miles in the Gulf of Mexico, residing in water depths at 10,000 feet and is over 1,000 feet thick and on average 2,000 feet thick. So if you see a bullseye in the middle of this class, you see that bullseye, it's got 1,000, 1,500, 500 stuff. That is called an isopac map. That word in Latin, isopac, means equal thickness. And so here is a oil field that was discovered by geophysical means after World War II. And you know what? It was discovered actually after the first deep wells began to be put into the Gulf of Mexico. And so let me summarize this argument about basin geology. I have studied this. I've got a workup on a wildcat well I want to drill as soon as Erica's teachers send me the $100,000. I'll do it myself. I've got local drillers that'll help me. I have studied this. I even taught petroleum geology at Virginia State University in the early 80s. And so I actually do know what I'm talking about. And so I would summarize it this way. Not a barrel of oil, not a cubic foot of natural gas has ever been found through the systematic application of geochronology or evolutionary stratigraphy. And with that, I would like to take a break.
A well-deserved break, Professor McQueen. That is an hour and 2 minutes. Time is flying by. We've gotten through several fantastic questions. I will, as you're on break, Professor McQueen, I will cover one question that I saw.
Good, please do.
Objection for about 10 minutes. So you get a 10-minute break, Professor McQueen, as I pointed out.
Good. Go ahead and drop my video in case I trip over my maps and stuff.
All right, brother. We'll see you soon. Okay, guys. So we have a ton of great questions. And as I pointed out before, we are planning on doing plenty more of these shows. And before I do get into a couple slides that I wanted to cover, I do want to go over the upcoming live stream section for everybody. We've done some rescheduling because a lot of our guests, including myself, have been sick. So nobody wants to do a debate when they're sick. Completely understandable. So there are a few shows that we've kind of shuffled around. And as you can see here, the next couple months are packed. So I'm just looking from my phone, and any other questions that come in for part 2 of this, once Professor McQueen gets back, let me know so I can save them. Okay, so we've shuffled around a few of these debates, but we are going to make sure we get to them. It's that season, cold and flu season, so it's just kind of the name of the game. It's what's to be expected. So that being said, the challenge we put out from Team Standing for Truth a couple weeks ago has been incredibly successful. I mean, we've got so many debates, so many creation evolution related debates. I've now filled up the next 2 months, so I am going to start scheduling for April and May. And we've got some big debates as well in the theology world that I'm currently working on scheduling. So as you can see here, we will be back tomorrow for Is There Reasonable Evidence for Evolution? Kent Hovind and Matthew Steele. Then the very next day we'll be here. I just confirmed today, Dr. Dan Biddle. We are going to be, he's going to be giving an awesome must-watch presentation on amazing proof of the flood, amazing evidence for Noah's flood. So guys, definitely be here. It'll be about an hour presentation, and then we'll do about 30 minutes of questions. So make sure you've got your questions as well. Then on the 28th, we've got a debate. The 31st, we got the much anticipated debate between Matt Mann and Jackson Rowe. And me and Jackson Rowe have rescheduled our debate for the 7th. So that should be fun. I've also got a debate with Luca that I need to confirm. Pick a day and time for that. So there are going to be a ton of debates for everybody. So as you can see here, I just booked a couple big ones for March and the end of next month as well. The battle continues. So this will be Mark Drysdale. He is back and he'll be debating Dr. Dino. So that's going to be a ton of fun. That'll be their round 4, but technically their second debate on evolution itself. Then Tom Jump versus Kent Hovind on March 8th and James W. on March 11th. Then on the 18th, we've got the big debate on sola fide. This one I'm incredibly excited for. The total inability debate, Dr. Leighton Flowers and CJ Cox, two fantastic debaters. They are going to be duking it out next month on the 24th, guys. So just make sure you are staying up to date on the upcoming live stream section. I'm also working on updating the website as we have had a ton of new videos, new content material, and so on and so forth. So me and the web designer are going to be working at updating the website. Okay, so in the meantime, real quick, I'm going to go over a couple slides here because one of the arguments in our good friend Gutsip Gibbons video there that we just addressed, one of the arguments on basin modeling has to do with separate ancestry. You know, we can't draw a line in ancestry, therefore everything's related. That's just the argument in a nutshell. Her and I actually debated that in a 2+ hour debate on Modern Day Debate, the question of ancestry. So I could spend the next 10 hours answering that argument and objection as to why, yes, we can draw a line in ancestry showing the evidence demonstrates separate ancestry versus universal ancestry. And I'm working on a ton of slides. I was up all night making slides actually on this topic. So I'm just going to cover one of the many. Okay. So if you don't believe me that this is a fantastic argument for separate ancestry, answering Erica's repeated argument, go watch my second debate with her where I utilized this argument. She didn't have an answer, and there hasn't been a sufficient answer provided since that debate either. They've tried and they've failed. So orphan genes, evidence for separate ancestry, just one of the many lines of evidence for separate ancestry. Okay, we're just going to cover one here while Professor McQueen is on break. Most creatures have genes unique to their kind, known as orphan genes. Evolutionists have trouble explaining orphan genes since there is no counterpart to them in other creature kinds that would connect them. And because descendants from a common ancestor should inherit similar genes from that ancestor. Random chance processes can explain orphan genes. Remember, these genes are fully functional and fully integrated into the information systems of living organisms. Okay, they don't just happen by chance for no reason at all. It appears they've been engineered to enable various kinds of creatures to thrive in specific environments and are the product of a designer. Exactly what we'd expect given the common design model, the common archetype model. If God created original creatures, original kinds, and front-loaded them with pre-existing functional DNA differences, we'd expect a lot of similarities, of course. A lot of similarities. That's how human engineers build. They build in homologous patterns, nested hierarchical patterns. But we should expect some differences, and some differences that cannot be explained by evolutionary processes, okay? True novel differences that evolutionary processes like selection and mutations, which are overwhelmingly deleterious, cannot explain, okay? And that's exactly what we find here when it comes to orphan genes. Technically speaking, orphan genes are expressed gene sequences that code for either a functional RNA molecule or a protein. The categorization of orphan is based on the evolutionary inconvenient problem. It's inconvenient because it's exactly what we would expect from a Genesis starting point, okay? Because the Bible says that man was specially created, that animals were created to bring forth after their kind, which means we have separate ancestry rather than universal ancestry. Universal ancestry saying that banana plants and whales are related through common ancestry. Now, we would predict the existence of these taxonomically restricted and essential genes given the Genesis starting point. The categorization of orphan is based on the, as we pointed out, evolutionarily inconvenient problem that these genes have no similar counterpart in their own genome or in any other organismal genome outside that particular taxon or type of creature. In the scientific literature, orphan genes are now commonly referred to as taxonomically restricted genes, or TRGs. The types of TRGs have different levels of taxonomic specificity. For example, some might be insect specific, and others might be specific to creatures such as bees, wasps, and ants, while others might be only found in a certain kind of ant. Okay, now there are rescue devices, of course. They look to gene duplication or de novo gene synthesis to explain the existence of orphan genes. The rescue devices have been looked at. They have failed. Okay, it is now well established that genes function in incredibly complex, hierarchical, interdependent, and exquisitely controlled networks. Here's the thing, guys. The genome is then both polyfunctional and polyconstrained. What this means is it's more likely that a mutation is going to disrupt genetic information, make things worse rather than make things better, okay? So yes, we can see a loss of orphan genes, for example, or the disruption of genetic functionality. But to see the evolution or the novel gain of something like an orphan gene, okay, that has never been observed in the lab. That has never been observed in nature. And that is highly unlikely given the fact that the genomes of living organisms is hierarchical, nested, okay, nested with amazing amounts of meta information. Okay. In addition, gene networks are dynamic and respond to all sorts of cues and signals that are constantly monitored by the cell systems. There is nothing equivalent to this level of complexity. Think about this, guys. Okay. We can write books that can be read forwards. Okay. But we can't write books that can be read both forwards and backwards. And every other word, there's another message. Okay. Multiple overlapping codes, multiple messages embedded in one, let's say, string of nucleotides. We can't do that. That's science fiction, what we're seeing on the molecular level. What that means is these sequences are constrained. Okay, one mutation is more likely going to disrupt that message since there's multiple overlapping messages, okay, that we see, rather than make the message better. There is nothing equivalent to this level of complexity, innovation, and efficiency in the engineered systems devised by the cleverness of mankind. Theoretical evolutionists would do well to take a lesson from computer programming. Seasoned programmers always reuse parts of their code and syntax. This is why this assumption of gene duplication, okay, when they're trying to look to similarity in the genomes of living organisms to say, well, this is where an orphan gene may have popped up. This is where there's something called neo-functionalization, okay? A region of the genome is duplicated, and then that duplicated region undergoes a series of beneficial mutations and brings about novel function, novel genes, okay? No, this is an assumption that's actually been refuted. This is an argument that's been refuted. And between different programs, in fact, all computer languages have a reserved set of keywords that are the same no matter what the program is. Other reserved words are related to certain built-in and third-party libraries that are called up during the course of programming. The same engineering principle is found in the genetic code of animal and planet genomes, just what we would expect to find if the story of creation and created kinds in Genesis were true. There are certain genetic words that are conserved at different levels of taxonomic specificity. The observed appearance of gene duplication is simply a standard principle of what? Engineered code. Orphan genes in humans are powerful evidence refuting the idea that we evolved from a common ancestor with chimpanzees. As you guys can see here, the source for here is Chimps and Genome, or Chimps and Humans, a geneticist discovers DNA evidence that challenges evolution by Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins. And their other rescue device, de novo gene synthesis, completely circular. It's a fictional process devoid of any realistic mechanism. Okay. And apparently, this is the supposed random, rapid, and magical mutational creation of fully functioning genes from non-coding DNA sequence or massive alterations of protein coding sequence. It would be like taking a chapter from a book, notice this, guys, randomly mixing up all the letters and then producing a completely different legible story replete with proper spelling and grammar. The reasoning, or lack thereof, regarding the magical production of orphan genes is a circular form of standard evolutionary logic that goes like this. Okay, this is the last thing I'll say, and we'll bring Professor McQueen back in. I could talk about this for an hour, but I need to just condense it into about 10 minutes. Therefore, they must have evolved rapidly via de novo gene synthesis. Notice this, that's the evolutionary thinking, right? Just like these, when it comes to taxonomy and cladistics, and these nested hierarchical patterns that they look to, you can look directly in their papers that they first assume there's a tree. They assume all life is related. They assume every single organism on the tree that they're looking at or building goes back to a root, is related. Okay, they have this assumption that all plants and animals are related. That cannot be questioned. There's no questioning the bigger picture. So therefore, orphan genes. How do we explain orphan genes? Well, orphan genes have no ancestral sequences in other creatures, evolutionists admit to this, that they evolved from. Therefore, they must have evolved. Notice, must have evolved. Okay, they're not questioning the bigger picture. They never question the bigger picture, never question the basic assumption. They must have evolved somehow, whether it's gene duplication or they popped up from non-coding areas of our genome to become integrated as protein coding genes. Via de novo gene synthesis. This is where the circularity comes in, guys. And de novo gene synthesis must be true because orphan genes exist. And orphan genes exist because of de novo gene synthesis. This faulty logic is called circular tautology. Notice the circularity in the thinking of those that believe banana plants and whales are related. There's no evidence for separate ancestry. There's no way we can draw a line in ancestry, people like Gutsick Gibbon point out. And yet here's one amazing line of evidence out of dozens and dozens that I can touch on and have touched on in the past that demonstrates, yes, separate ancestry, not universal ancestry. So I know that was long-winded, guys, but I just wanted to get through those slides. And here's Professor David McQueen back with us. Good to have you back, Professor McQueen.
Now you notice I've gone through a wardrobe change. We're going to be talking about some chemistry. If the boss Donnie approves, you want me to go over that limestone question that we anticipated, or you want to save that and have me cover another one?
We'll save that if we have time at the end. And why don't we get to another one of these?
Let's go on to my next one here.
Okay. So, all right, let's see here. Question from, this one came in from one of our members. Actually, you know what? This one came in from your good friend Jackson Rowe near the beginning. So let me make sure. I'm going to put it in the chat here and put it up on the screen. Jackson Rowe asks, Professor McQueen, he says, not geologic, but kind of flood Noah's Ark related. He says, how would animals with specific diet requirements survive the Ark?
Okay, Jackson, let me think about caterpillars and other things that you brought up in our previous debate, and I'll set my timer here and tell you about some research that I've had my biology buddies help me. Donnie has been kind to create a list of my presentations, but so far I've only had 2 debates, if I remember correctly, and the last one was with Jackson Rowe, and you can find this debate and find an elaboration on what his argument is, and his argument is an argument about diet. He has pointed out that there are certain creatures that have very unique dietary requirements. Now, he had presented an argument based on salamanders, and I will save that for the end of my discussion here, because I have been looking into this issue of the salamanders by calling some of my biology buddies who are I think it's correctly called herpetologists, flipping over rocks in the Great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina looking for red salamanders and so forth. But let's focus for now on the idea of diet. And his basic argument is that the diet of these creatures is so specific that Noah and his sons and daughters-in-law and his wife, the 8 of them, could never have gathered the very specific dietary requirements needed by every creature on board the ark. Jackson is to be complimented because he has an interest in endangered species, modern endangered species that get cut off from their ecological niche and so forth. And so I compliment him on that, but I critique him on this. Jackson's mistake is the mistake of so many of the evolutionary community, and that is they consider ancient man to be ignorant, and they are unaware of an excellent book that you can find online. I think it's 10 years old now, that is called The Genius of Ancient Man. It's a book published by Master Books. If you read that book, Jackson, you'll find dozens and dozens of arguments that present the idea that ancient man was not stupid, but quite smart. And the counter argument to what Jackson has said so many times, the counter argument is that Noah and his family did not go out and gather salamanders, beetles, worms. They moved near the door of the ark. Now, in depictions of this on movies and so forth, you often see a crowd of giraffes and elephants going on board the ark. You don't often see Stegosaurus and his mate going on board the ark. You do not often see this creature, which is related to Triceratops. Obviously, it's got a lot more horns on this carapace here than that. So you often see lions and tigers and stuff, but you don't see these guys walking on board the ark. And that's because the evolutionary community believes that the evolution of all these different creatures, including the phenomenally insane idea that Dwayne Gish, back in the 1970s and 80s, he had so much fun with this. The very idea of a cow jumping into the water and through evolutionary mechanisms becoming a whale that could lactate and then come back up on land and then go back and so forth. It's a ridiculous argument. The whales did not have to be on board the ark. Why? Because they were in the ocean and they could live through it. The cows, however, did have to be on board the ark, and there were not just 2 of them, since they're clean animals. There were 7 of them. So now, what I am arguing in this, see how much time I've got left here. Got 4 minutes left. What I'm arguing here is that spiders can walk, cockroaches can walk, salamanders can walk or crawl. I don't quite know what word to use. Worms could certainly slither over, snakes and so forth. And so it's not just creatures with 4 legs that could walk to the ark, or creatures like gibbons and monkeys that could swing and stumble toward the ark. The very idea that some National Geographic lovers portray the evolution of man from knuckle-dragging chimps and gibbons and apes is just insane. But let's try to focus a little bit here. Is the diet a problem? Is the diet of all these creatures a problem? No. And it's for 2 reasons. The Creator God who created all these creatures brought them to the ark. Secondly, Noah himself was a ace. He was a savant. He was a genius. And so were the other 7 members of his family. And so when he walked down the ramp of the ark and saw this group of insects come to him, he no doubt could take his scooper and walk over to the creatures and say, oh, there are just the 2 cockroaches to be on board. And then they would go down into his collection device. There are the cockroaches. Take them in, Shem. And then he would go to the spiders and say, oh, those are the spiders that have the greatest genetic potential to, with time, breed other spiders. Let's put them in, take them in the collection device, and put them in the ark. So Noah did not have to guess the dietary requirements of these creatures. The Lord God himself orchestrated this. Now, Jackson, as I have studied your critique in the past, since we had the debate, I've called some of my buddies that are more aware of dietary requirements and so forth. And they have pointed out to me something that I certainly find fascinating. The fellow who wrote under the nom de plume, nom de guerre, of John Woodmorape. His actual name is Jan Petchkus, and I have met him. He's been a guest at our house. And Petchkus was not married at the time he did this, because he certainly could not have done this if he had been a married man. But he lived in the Chicago area, and he went to the various museums there, and he compiled a list of the genus and species of all the animals that could have been on board the ark. Let me find my card here. And he did a remarkable job in cataloging this. Finally, I get to it. This is his 1993 work. He said that there were probably 16,000 animals on board the ark, 8,000 genera, maybe 4,000 different families. 46% of the ark would have been taken up or could have been taken up by the animals, 12% for food, 8% for water, and now we understand we've got to add the manure at the bottom. The amount of water that they would have needed, by the way, to last a year would have been something like 3 times 10 to the 6 liters of water. But here's the kicker that ties into this question. Most genera, 869 genera of animals, are actually less than 10 grams in mass. Think of a hummingbird, for example. There are 2,000 genera that are around 100 grams. Think of a rat. 258 genera of something like a hippo that weighs 10 tons, but only 53 genera of dinosaurs, only 1 or 2 weighing 100 tons. Think through those numbers, and you'll see that there was plenty of wisdom and plenty of room on board the ark. Donnie?
All right, another very thorough answer, Professor McQueen. We got some side chat debates going on as well. One that I was kind of involved in there too. So let's see what question we have here. Let's see. Professor McQueen, maybe we can do a speed round on a few of these, just a couple minute responses to some of these questions.
Okay.
Because we have
the pickled grammar. What I'll do is I'll start my timer, but I'll limit myself to 2 minutes on each question. Does any creation scientist know the original position of the magnetic North Pole? The answer to that is no, and I will add this. The evolutionary community, including one of my professors at Michigan, a guy named Rob Vandervoo, are experts in the determination of the direction of the North Pole in sediments. Vandervoo received his training in Europe. A lot of his work is in Europe, but he was very active at Michigan in the mid-70s and is still alive as far as I know. And his students have spread worldwide doing this. They will go out into the field and they will find a group of rocks which have enough iron in them to be able to record a magnetic signature. They will then look at that rock as it's in the outcrop, and they will mark a north arrow on it, actually in the field, and that is present north. Present north. Then they'll take it back to the lab and attempt a very complicated process to figure out where magnetic north was. Okay, next question.
All right, I appreciate that answer, Professor McQueen. So here is the next question that comes in. And again, I want to thank everybody in the audience for so many good questions. This has really been a great audience Q&A, and man, time is flying by. Okay, so this one comes in from Brother Timothy, another member for 2 months. Does Professor McQueen agree the Kingston Range broke off, vibrated 60 miles across the landscape from its root in a post-flood earthquake?
Brother Timothy, I have no idea what you're talking about. So let's go to the next question.
No worries. I just work here, Professor McQueen. I just gather them and read them.
That's okay. Kingston Range may be in Australia. I don't remember.
I don't know. Sometimes the specifics I don't know either. So here we go. Okay. This one comes in from Chris Peacock. This is a follow-up to your answer on, I think it was either the first or second question that we had.
Yeah.
So Chris Peacock says, you only see bent rocks in hills and mountains. If the rock was soft, how high are you going to get a mountain out of soft rock?
Well, how are you going to get a mountain? Okay, let's go back to the Play-Doh. I had thought that I had made this clear earlier, but apparently not. So let's go back to it. Let's see, how can I make this more clear? Okay, our argument is that the engineering geology parameters of Young's modulus, tensile stress, and so forth, our argument is that all of that indicates that something as rigid as this model here could never have been bent without breaking. And so the fact that you find the anticlines and then the smiley face synclines is an argument that the rocks were soft during deformation. Now, how would we then build on that? Put the dinosaurs over here in case we need them again. Drumsticks. So let's go back with another diagram. See if I can make this more clear. Okay, one of the most famous mountains is that big one in Tibet. Let's go into Jeopardy here. You can guess the name of it. Begins with E. What is it, Donnie?
Oh, can you ask again, Professor McQueen? I was caught up in the question.
Okay, no problem. The big mountain in Tibet that begins with the letter E would be Mount Everest, right? Yeah, Mount Everest. So let's go there. It's a very tall mountain. And I'll draw it here. And consistent with the way I do things, I will draw a tree, which you're never going to find at the top of Everest, but it is there. Everest consists of numerous rocks. And so let's draw some in here. I don't know exactly where they are. This is tens of thousands of feet high now, but it wasn't at first. You find rocks that have folds in them and rocks that have fossils in them in Everest. Now, I'm going to use a black color to mark the fossils in these rocks. It doesn't matter actually what they are, but it does matter that there would be some confusion. So one of the principles of geology that flood geologists have no problem at all with is the law of originally horizontal layers. So when you see a tilted or folded rock, the assumption is that it started out flat. And so the evolutionary community, of course, believes that over millions of years, these rock layers were laid down. And I'll use both black and blue here to mark this. So they would imagine that tectonic forces during the building of Everest would have bent those rocks into what we see now over a long Earth millions of years. The creationist counter argument to this is that Mount Everest probably obtained its height either late in the flood or perhaps in a period after the flood that I call post-flood residual catastrophe. This is several hundred years after the end of the flood. At any rate, Mount Everest rose up through catastrophic plate tectonics and the collision of the Indian plate, I think it would be called, with the Asian plate. And so Everest was uplifted during this time. Okay, let's go on to the next question.
All right, great answers all around, Professor McQueen. So I'm looking at the questions here, and yeah, we're definitely gonna have to do a part 2 of this. So let me pick out. You know what? I'm going to go with this question, Professor McQueen, that we've answered here. We've had you answer many times, but it is still one of their main arguments. So let's deal with it.
Okay, good. I'm glad. You know, we realize, Donnie, that new members join. For example, the overall is more than 7,000 now that are part of Standing for Truth.
Absolutely. That's right.
And so new members are joining all the time. So I don't mind a repetition. Go ahead and tell me what it is.
Awesome. Okay, so I appreciate that, Professor McQueen, and I love how thorough your answers are. So here's the question. I'll set the foundation for it as well, kind of summarize it like this. Critics of young Earth creation have made the claim, Professor McQueen, that the existence of limestone refutes young Earth creation. They will say that limestone is particularly problematic because it cannot accumulate during a flood. Is there any validity to this argument? And can the young Earth creation model explain the world's limestone?
Well, with your permission, I'm going to take 10 minutes on this one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I actually anticipated this question and have done some research and have robbed Mrs. McQueen's pantry for a number of chemicals that will help us to explain this. Sodium bicarbonate is used for a sick stomach, and the sodium bicarbonate that's in here is the chemical cousin to calcium carbonate, which limestone is made of. So let's begin to put all these cousins together. We need a ocean basin to put it in. Apologies to my urologist for using my hydration water to do this, but I'm sure he'll understand. And so now we've got the floodwaters, and this antacid here is sodium bicarbonate. So we drop some sodium bicarbonate in here, and it's not dissolving real quickly. And so to make the calcium carbonate, let me get my notes here. Limestone is not a problem for flood geology. It's an evidence of the flood. Isn't that an interesting way to say it? We have to have some limestone vocabulary class to understand this better. Limestone is a sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rocks are divided into chemical versus clastic rocks. many limestones are so fossil rich that they're called coquina. It's very common in Florida. If you're listening to this in continental Europe, it's very common, at least in the British vocabulary, to call this a shelly limestone. So that would be an example of an organic rich one. But what about the inorganic origin of a limestone type called micrite? Now, micrite, you have to understand, is ordinarily dove gray in appearance. It forms a mud in the Bahamas near the United States. Solidified micrite I've seen in Tennessee, Canada, and Israel in my field work. So let's go back to the rock I was using earlier and use it a different way. It turns out that this rock here is a huge chert nodule. But what we're going to do is we're going to imagine this, and I hope it looks to your eye a little bit gray, maybe in this view. We're going to imagine this to be micrite. And we're going to ask the question, how could micrite form through the chemistry of Noah's ocean? Well, we've got to change that chemistry a bit. Why don't we do this? There's so many plants that have died. There's going to be all kinds of charcoal in the flood ocean. And so let's get a bit of this charcoal out. This thing cost me $25 US. I don't want to waste it. It's so good if you end up getting poisoned to have activated charcoal around. So that's probably $1 worth there, but you guys are well worth it. And so let's put this activated charcoal in here and use the drumstick to simulate the movement of the floodwaters. So we got this charcoal. Oh, look, we've got that sodium bicarbonate down there. And we got all this activated charcoal. Well, what else do we need? Well, we need some Tums. Why Tums? Because Tums, if you read the back, is calcium carbonate. Well, isn't that amazing? So now we've got some limestone here. I don't know how many of you knew that you were eating limestone when you took Tums, but it's something to keep in mind. And so we'll put the limestone, the calcium carbonate, in here. And so let's look to see if we all have all the correct ingredients. And so let's go back to our chart here. So we need to make something called a limestone mud. And so let's review it again. Limestone is a sedimentary rock. It's a chemical sedimentary rock. And there it is. It's calcium carbonate. And the way we get that is by a calcium ion. I changed out of my geology clothes into my lab clothes here. So we need a calcium ion. We need CO2. Now wait, CO2, what is that? Help me to remember. That's carbon dioxide, isn't it? And that is emitted from volcanoes. All kinds of fountains of the great deep bursting forth. Plenty of calcium, CO2 in the water. Well, how do we go from that to calcium carbonate? Well, this is the way we do it. You have in our ocean an abundance of carbon, excess carbon. You saw me put in calcium carbonate. You saw me put in sodium hydroxide from this other source here, sodium bicarbonate. And so now we're in a position to talk about the direct precipitation from seawater of this calcium carbonate. Now, notice that as we think about this, we need the water to be hot and salty. And so here we go. Morton salt. Let's pour some of that into Noah's Ocean. And so now we've got salt. I think you can actually see it in the bottom there. There's the salt and the other things. And so now, boom, we got a volcano going off, putting plenty of carbon dioxide in the water. And so this all gets stirred up. But what's better than that, it's not only stirred up, but it's heated. Heated salt water becomes what an economic geologist, mine geologist, calls hydrothermal brine. And so now we got this hydrothermal brine moving around. And, oh, look at this. Milk of magnesia. I occasionally take this. It is magnesium hydroxide. So if we're going to make the mineral, the rock dolomite or the mineral dolomite, we need to make it calcium magnesium carbonate. So let's add, man, that's hard to get open. Been a while since anybody's taken this drug. So let's pour in some magnesium carbonate. Now it's been colored pink. Sometimes actual dolomite really is pink. So here we got the pink and all this, and we're heating it up. And we now have enough information to finish up. We got the chlorine, the delta stands for heat. And then we got three other parameters. We have got pH, EH, and temperature. Well, it turns out if you look at that in some detail for sedimentary rocks, you can go to books and look this up. Now, remember that sedimentary rocks are one type of igneous, metamorphic ore and sedimentary rocks, 4 types. Limestone being the one that we're focusing on here. And then we come, if we had drumsticks, oh, we do. We have a drum roll. How do we get the actual crystal of calcite? This is called a cleavage rhombohedron of calcite here. How do we get the calcium carbonate? Well, the way we get that is we got all of these chemicals from calcium to CO2 that are producing CaCO3, which is calcite, which I showed you. And what we're varying is called the EH. If you remember your high school chemistry, that's the electrical properties around it. We're varying the pH, which is the acidity of the Noah's Ocean. And we're varying the temperature. When we vary all those parameters, we turn around and within a day, not a million years, you have the precipitation of the limestone directly from the seawater. Donnie, can we go on to the next one?
Absolutely. So if I could ask a follow-up question to that, and I love how detailed you are, Professor McQueen, and I love the experiments that we get in on these questions. So when they say, when it comes to the formation of limestone, right, what we need is warm water, calm seas, low pressure, and low acidity. They'll say the requirements for the limestone precipitation, deposition, and accumulation, the requirements would not be there during the global flood year, because the global flood would have been catastrophic. There would have been too much heat.
Yeah, I know the answer to it.
Go ahead.
You and I and our wives and children, need a vacation in the Caribbean, in the Bahamas. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
So let's get these critics to pay our way to one of the islands in the Bahamas called Andros Island. Now, my geology professors, I have to laugh at this. My geology professors claimed that they were studying carbonate petrology, and they would go down with their wives for a week or two to the Bahamas. Why? Because on Andros Island, you can walk out into micrite mud, and you can scoop up some of this dove gray mud. My professors, who were deep time evolutionists, would pick the mud up and say, "Oh, look how slow it's forming right now." And so they wouldn't bother to measure all those parameters. If you've ever been to the Caribbean, I never have, apparently the water is very pretty and clear. It doesn't look like the mud of this, does it? And the reason it doesn't is that the chemistry of the Great Flood, many of you may know that standard Coca-Cola has a very low pH, it's a very acidic drink. That acidity varied during the time of the Great Flood, but because of the constancy of the Gulf Stream, which passes by the Bahamas, the water chemistry is pretty constant. So they don't see a change because they weren't part of Noah's flood.
So you would say in a nutshell, Professor McQueen, that they are misrepresenting or misunderstanding the flood model when they say that the condition for
to narrow it even further, they are misunderstanding the chemistry of the flood, which can be very complicated. And at a graduate level, some of you in the class may actually have a PhD in chemistry, for all I know. Well, you know that I have simplified using what many call kitchen chemistry to talk about this sort of thing. And so that's how I would answer that. Now, we're almost up to the 2-hour break or ending. Could I make a summary comment and then turn it over to you, my friend?
Absolutely. Professor McQueen, if I could sneak this last question in, I think it might only take you a couple minutes to answer. And then all the other questions I'll save for an additional show on this.
Okay.
You've done a fantastic job, Professor McQueen. Lots of great feedback, lots of great comments, and we've had a great audience the whole time. So
yeah, I'm a bit tired because George wasn't here. He usually does half of this.
That's a good point. Okay.
Read it to me.
So here's the question. This is another challenge and criticism that comes up almost every debate these days, Professor McQueen. So the argument is, how did the ark survive the cracking of the planet when the fountains of the great deep were broken open?
Okay. This is our model of the ark that was never intended to navigate. There's no biblical evidence that it had a rudder or a sail or anything. Why? Because the ark is an analogy to the salvation of the Lord Jesus. Remember that God is the creator in Genesis chapter 1. But by the time we get up to the sin of Adam and Eve, he is the offended creator. And we can't leave that out. That mankind had become corrupt and evil at the time of the flood. They all had to be destroyed. Dr. Henry Morris estimated that there were 1 billion people alive. Petchkus, the guy I mentioned a minute ago, 100 million. It doesn't matter how many. They all died except the 8 on board the ark. So the ark is a symbol of God's salvation. Now, if we coat it in pitch on the outside and on the inside, that helps to preserve it when it lands. But what keeps it, what keeps it away from the fountains of the great deep exploding upward like this? So you got the fountains of the great deep coming up. You've got tremendous waves going. It is a fact of naval architecture that a barge like the Ark in a tsunami would just go over gentle waves. The tsunami would actually pass underneath it. An example of this is the earthquake that occurred in the South Pacific, or the volcanic eruption that occurred in the South Pacific in the last 30 days. They figured the island, was it the island of Tonga? I can't remember. They figured the island would be wiped out, but it wasn't. According to what I read, the sea only rose maybe 3 feet, and 3 or 4 people died. Not a big deal. The second thing you need to understand about the Ark is that its position as the fountains of the great deep were broken up, they were not controlled by Noah. He was a passenger on board the Ark. He's an analogy to God's grace. It's God's grace that directed the Ark. Oh no, Jesus said to God the Father, there's a fountain of the great deep coming up near equatorial Africa. And so the Ark would be directed around that. And then the Holy Spirit would say, oh no, God the Father, there is a fountain of the great deep coming up in what will ultimately be Canada. Well, we'll direct the Ark around that. So for the New Testament analogy of the Ark to hold firm, for Peter to be able to say that it is a symbol of God's saving grace, we can't X out the guidance, the control of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit during the flood.
Amen. Well said.
Can I go ahead with my final comments and then hand it over to you?
Yes. Yeah, we'll hand it over to you.
Here's one of my newest toys. And if you look at it, you'll see that it's a plastic part inside a heart. Yeah, it's a plastic part inside a heart. As a matter of fact, it's an Edwards sapien. I guess that's to make sure that it's not going into an ape, but going into a man. Here's an Edwards sapien transcatheter heart valve. Now, Donnie knows what that means. Transcatheter means that this thing is collapsed and put into the artery, and then it unfolds to form an artificial valve. That's what I get from it. Donnie, would you think that that's what transcatheter heart valve would be? Do you think, Donnie? I think it is. Why would I bring it up? Why do I make this my closing argument? An area we haven't explored tonight is intelligent design. If men in the 21st century can design a heart valve that works and keeps a person alive, do we have any trouble in believing the truth of God's word when it comes to our ultimate end? Worldwide, COVID has caused tremendous anxiety. Many have died from sicknesses over the last 2 years. What if these people believed that there was evidence in the first part of the Bible that supports evidence in the last chapter of the Bible? Last chapter is Revelation. Last book is Revelation. Last chapter is chapter 22. And so we read here, and there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants will serve him. Dr. Henry Morris pointed out to me years ago that means that the Puritans were right. Work is not a bad thing. Let's get out and get a job, because we're going to work in heaven too. And they shall see his face, and his name shall be on their foreheads. And there shall be no night there, and no need for a candle, neither light of the sun, for the Lord God giveth them light, and they shall reign forever and ever. God is light. And so in Genesis chapter 1, he showed the light. Other Old Testament passages show that God created the darkness. God didn't have to create light because he is light. George is always very careful at the end of his presentation to extend an invitation to our entire audience that they put their trust in Christ. And so I will do the same. Back to you, Donnie.
Amen. Well said. Well said, Professor McQueen. That was a fantastic show, an awesome audience Q&A. Professor McQueen, you are a real blessing to this ministry. And as you put it earlier, we've had a lot of new followers. We actually have a secondary channel that I've been re-uploading everything to. And we're almost at 20,000 followers there. Because we had a video there on the flood that Ramad and I released about a year ago, and it ended up going viral. It's at 1.1 million views. So that channel is...
Needless to say, I'm thankful to be part of your ministry, but I'm also out of breath and out of steam. So I'm going to move my cursor down and leave the studio and leave you to wind it up.
All right. God bless you.
We will see you next time.
We will see you next time. God bless, Professor McQueen. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the show tonight. I did want to leave no stone unturned on the question that I was answering during Professor McQueen's break on one of the challenges that young Earth creationist critic Gutsick Gibbon was putting forth in her video. We actually addressed several of her so-called irrefutable arguments against young Earth creation, specifically limestone, fossil fuel industry, and separate ancestry. So when it comes to separate ancestry, I was pointing out the existence of orphan genes, these taxonomically restricted and essential genes found in living organisms that are exactly what we would expect to find if the Genesis story of special creation were true. And it's exactly what we find. Now, these genes, these functional genetic sequences, are fully integrated into the genomic networks of living organisms. Okay, there's no way for the evolutionists to explain the existence of these essential genes, as I've explained, through evolutionary processes like selection and mutations. Remember, natural selection doesn't create anything novel. Natural selection is a fine-tuning mechanism that keeps a species as strong as it can be. It selects that which is already there. And mutations, which are supposed to provide the source for all novel genetic variation and diversity, mutations turn out to be overwhelmingly damaging, disease-causing, and deleterious. So the type of variation, for the most part, that you get from mutations would be negative, while the beneficial variation that we find in the information systems of living organisms are better explained as created heterozygosity, as we put it on this channel. Heterozygosity being a state of genetic diversity, a state of genetic differences. The type of variation that you get from mutations is the type of negative variation you get on your car when you park too close to another car and they, smack their door against your car and you get a ding, a bump, a bruise, a rust mark, Okay, these are essentially the types of variations you get from mutations. But the beneficial variation, the fact that the genomes are near fully functional, we're finding, and every single day we're finding more and more functional components of our genome. That would better be explained as front-loaded genetic diversity, okay? So when I was talking about orphan genes earlier, we had one of the evolutionists in the side chat repeating the rescue device of de novo gene synthesis. We touched on gene duplication as to why that doesn't work. We touched on that earlier. Horizontal gene transfer wouldn't work. And de novo gene synthesis wouldn't work. We touched on why that is circular. Okay, so the basic paradigm for orphan genes is due to the fact that they appear suddenly in a type of creature with no evidence of any past evolutionary ancestry. That's why we call them orphans, right? Because there is no evidence for any ancestral sequences that would have led to the origin of these genes. They look like they are just there. They appear suddenly, an explosion of them in the genomes of living organisms. That's not to say that you can't lose orphan genes over time. Think about it. As biblical creationists, we look back in time to the expansion of genetic information, the expansion of genetic diversity, right? And in the thousands of years that have passed since creation, and the couple thousand years that have passed, roughly the 4,500 years that have passed since the flood, there have been shifts in genetic diversity. There has been a loss of genetic diversity. And the evolutionists, they look back to what? They look back to the contraction of genetic information, because they're going back billions of years ago to that first self-replicating cell that would have evolved into a multi-celled organism, that would have evolved into a fish, right? Farm, fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal. Okay, so this type of evolution, this type of change and novelty would require the expansion of genetic information, the expansion of genetic novelty. You'd need to explain the existence of new body plans, phenotypic complexity, so on and so forth. Essentially, the evolutionists have to explain the evolution or the origin of the four-dimensional genome with multiple overlapping codes, chock full of meta information. They have to explain that. Okay. So over time, when you get shifts in, let's say, heterozygosity, which is more genetic diversity, to homozygosity, which is less genetic diversity, you are going to have, as a result of these shifts, you are going to have a loss of orphan genes. Okay, the point is there's no consistent hierarchy when it comes to orphan genes. But oftentimes the evolutionists, they will look to the loss of orphan genes and assume that we have a gain of orphan genes, right? Let's say we have a distribution of orphan genes, taxonomically restricted genes, within species of the same family, and we would say that family is a created kind. That means within that family, all the species, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, okay? So all the species within that family would be related through ancestry. Well, based on the distribution of the orphan genes within that family, okay, they'll say, well, how do you explain that creation? It's because it looks like you've had the origin of a new orphan gene, when in fact, what we're seeing is a loss of orphan genes, a loss of orphan genes, a loss of genetic diversity. The sorting out of the original front-loaded genetic diversity doesn't explain the origin of the genetic diversity, the origin of the orphan genes. And that's why we point out consistently, based on empirical scientific evidence and data, that it's much easier to break down a gene, to lose a gene, than to build one up, than to explain a new orphan gene, for example. Okay, so the point is, when it comes to universal common ancestry, there is no consistent hierarchy when it comes to orphan genes. Yes, we see a loss of orphan genes. We actually see through experimental evidence, we see it in, I believe it's fruit flies. We see that a lot of these orphan genes are only expressed under certain environmental conditions, which is fascinating. And I think I have that here. Okay, right here. Orphan genes are demonstrated to have key roles in a variety of complex genetic and biochemical pathways in a variety of creatures across the spectrum of life. They have also been linked to their function with other genes in elaborate networks of interdependence and regulatory control. In fact, some of these genes can be lethal to the organism when mutated and disrupted. Isn't that fascinating? Okay, they'll often say, well, most of the genome is non-functional, evolutionary leftovers, evolutionary junk. But yet when you mutate a lot of these genes and genetic sequences and regions of the genome that the evolutionists say are there for really no reason at all, just evolutionary leftovers, what results is disease, because you're disrupting something that is necessary and essential and functional for healthy life processes in the cell of that living organism. So you mutate it and it leads to disease. That means it's functional. It's there for a reason. It's not junk like the evolutionists would say. And we find with these taxonomically restricted and essential genes that when they are mutated or disrupted, what results is disease, which is exactly what we'd expect. All of this amazing research begs the question of how these organism-specific genes could appear. Okay, the question to the evolutionists is, how could these genes, organism-specific genes, how can they appear suddenly and fully integrated into complex networks in the genome without, here's the question, without being designed and engineered from the very beginning? De novo gene synthesis doesn't work. That's circular. Okay. The thinking process of these evolutionists is, well, we have these taxonomically restricted and essential genes that have no evidence for ancestry. Okay, that's why we call them orphans. They're fully integrated into the complex networks of the genomes of living organisms. How'd they get there? Well, they reject right off the bat front-loaded diversity, design diversity, and the common archetype model, okay, to explain similarities and homologous and nested hierarchical patterns. So the bigger picture to them, the assumption is that all life is related. And they assume naturalism, naturalistic evolution. So how did these get there? Well, de novo gene synthesis, right? They must have popped up through non-coding areas of the genome, become functional, or gene duplication. You got a duplicated region of the genome, neo-functionalization, you get a series of beneficial mutations, and bam. Okay. They're assuming universal common ancestry, assuming that these were not originally designed and engineered from the beginning. So de novo gene synthesis. And why de novo gene synthesis? Well, because of the existence of orphan genes. Do you see how circular this is? And I pointed this out in my debate with Erica. I've had several debates with her, but I highly recommend watching that debate. If you think they have an answer, they don't. De novo gene synthesis is circular, okay? And they're desperately, you see this with Dodgeball Dan, they have papers that they'll point you to where you're not actually seeing an orphan gene pop up. You're not actually seeing the evolution of these essential genes. They're looking at what they assume may be the sequences of genes that pre-existed the orphan genes, okay? And a lot of this comes down to homologous patterns in the genomes of living organisms. And Ryan Daniel, he says, I'd like to see you yourself do a debate, Brother Donnie. Yeah, I appreciate that. I've now had about 94 formal debates, most of them on evolution. I've taken a break over the last couple months when it comes to evolution debates, but I'm in the midst of scheduling several now on ancestry. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to these debates because the evidence suggests separate ancestry, and I've seen no good rebuttal and no good response to the evidence that suggests separate ancestry. So I appreciate that, Ryan Daniel. Okay. Now, they are assuming universal common ancestry in order to put forth these explanations, de novo gene synthesis, gene duplication, so on and so forth. Okay. But they have no supporting evidence. Another very intrigued aspect of orphan genes is that they have also been shown to be associated. This is what I was talking about earlier, guys, with the unique and specific adaptability of an organism to its environmental niche. Okay, here's a prediction we can make based on the design hypothesis. Remember, the Bible says that we are made in the image of God. That means we, as human beings, must reflect something about the design. There must be something in us, about us, that reflects the design, or the divine, reflects God. Well, if we are made in God's image, then we may be able to get a sense for how God designed the world, designed the biological world, biological systems, based on the way we as humans design and build things. And we now know today there are many modes of transportation, many vehicles that have built-in mechanisms, okay, safety mechanisms that, for example, if you are driving on an icy road, you have human engineers that have built into these vehicles mechanisms that can alert the vehicle, right, to be more safe. If the vehicle is going into another lane, it'll push it, lane control, for example, or you're getting too close to another vehicle and, the car will alert you, or all of these different inbuilt mechanisms. So we predict, okay, maybe we'll find this same thing in living organisms, design adaptability. And that's exactly what we see. That's exactly what we see when it comes to epigenetics, this extra layer of functional complexity on top of the genetic code, where you've got millions and millions of genetic switches just waiting to be turned on via environmental cue. And we see that with pseudogenes. Many non-coding RNA genes, like pseudogenes, are only expressed under certain conditions. And same thing goes for these orphan genes, right? That's why we see rapid adaptive episodes where you have these creatures, they enter a new environment and genetic switches are turned off and bam, they rapidly adapt. Okay. We have plenty of examples of this. This is all evidence of forward thinking, which points us back to the forward thinker. How do evolutionists, through natural evolutionary processes like selection and mutations, how do they build that which requires long-term planning, long-term thinking? Because natural selection sees the short term. Natural selection isn't worried about you getting cancer in 40, 50 years. It's worried about tomorrow. Selection acts in the short term. So how do evolutionary mechanisms build that which requires long-term planning, long-term thinking? They can't. How does selection build something like a spare tire, right? The functional redundancy that we see all throughout the genome. We heard earlier from Andrew Cumming, well, we've got, neutral variation, third position codon variation, these statistical hierarchies that can only be true if universal common ancestry is true. But what's funny is even that is being overturned. It's this old school thinking, one gene, one protein, one function. That's old school thinking. That's decades ago biology, okay? Because now we're actually seeing protein multifunctionality. It's called protein moonlighting. We have these proteins that are functioning in many different ways that were never predicted or anticipated, okay? And we see that with this third position codon variation, where these positions are not just there to now tolerate error, they're actually there to help slow and speed processes in the cell. Multifunctionality. So are we looking at neutral variation or functional variation as the design model would predict? None of this, science fiction at the molecular level, can be explained through natural evolutionary processes. They can't explain that which is in our genome that requires forward thinking. That points us back to the forward thinker. Another very intrigued aspect of orphan genes is that they have also been shown to be associated with the unique and specific adaptability of an organism to its environmental niche. Notice this. As an amazing case in point, the well-studied little animal called the water flea contains many orphan genes that are only expressed, this is what I was pointing out earlier, under specific sets of environmental conditions and stresses related to water availability. Exactly what I was pointing out. From the design hypothesis, we can look at things that we design and we can predict that that's what we will find in the biological world. And that's exactly what we find. We as human engineers build in homologous patterns. Take all sedans, for example. All sedans share a huge number of features and similarities, okay? That all categorize them as sedans, right? They're all a certain height from the ground, doors on either side, windshield, whatever. There's all these different characteristics that make up a sedan. All sedans are very similar, but then you can bring in a hatchback, which is also very similar to a sedan. A hatchback is way more similar to a sedan than a sedan is to an SUV or a sedan is to an airplane or a boat, right? So sedans and hatchbacks share enough with each other, okay, that they can be nested within each other, but enough dissimilarity, enough non-similarity that you got hatchbacks, sedans, you can bring in SUVs, sedans, hatchbacks, and SUVs all share more with each other than sedans, hatchbacks, SUVs, and a boat or an airplane. But there's enough similarity in all designed modes of transportation, even a boat and an airplane or a motorcycle, that we can build these groups within groups patterns, just like we see in the biological world. Okay. Vehicles from North America, vehicles from Europe, vehicles from Asia, all share a tremendous amount of features with each other. That doesn't prove that they all evolved from a common Arctic ancestor somewhere in Antarctica or something. No, it's because human designers build in homologous patterns because it makes sense from a design perspective. And guess what? We see homologous patterns. We see nested hierarchical patterns in the biological world because humans and chimpanzees share more with each other than humans and dogs. That doesn't mean that they're related in the same way. That it doesn't mean because sedans and hatchbacks share more with each other than sedans and SUVs that they're all related. No, nested hierarchical patterns and homologous patterns are expected by both the design model and the universal ancestry model. Okay, same things with these interesting mosaics, these interesting, so-called transitional forms, like the therapsids, mammal-like reptiles, and also the we can see today with the platypus, they look to Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik. Well, human engineers build what's called amphibious assault vehicles. Okay, human engineers build vehicles, military vehicles that are specific for the sea and vehicles that are specific for the land. But what about those moments where you want a vehicle that can kind of bridge sea and land? And then that's why we design amphibious assault vehicles or crossover SUVs. Ever since the invention of these crossover SUVs, categorizing vehicles has been become incredibly difficult. Just that you ever seen like the Ford Flax, the Jeep Gladiator, the Dodge Journey? Okay. Is it an SUV? Is it a Jeep? Is it a van? No, but it's designed that way. We have interesting mosaics in the design world and in the biological world. All of these lines of evidence are expected by the design model. And it's the differentiating lines of evidence like the existence of orphan genes, like molecular clocks, genome-wide functionality, okay, functional endogenous retroviruses, functional ALU sequences, functional retrotransposons, pseudogenes. I mean, talk about egg on people like William Lane Craig and Dennis Venema. Talk about egg on their face. You've heard them for years and years. Francis Collins, they'll say pseudogenes are the number one best evidence that suggests humans and chimps are related and go back to a common ancestor. And yet now we know, paper after paper, demonstrating that pseudogenes are necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. They're there for a reason. We're looking at functional DNA elements predicted by the design hypothesis. These are the differentiating lines of evidence that the evolutionists cannot explain. And every single rescue device that they've put forth when it comes to the existence of these orphan genes have failed and flopped miserably. The basic paradigm for orphan genes is due to the fact that they appear suddenly in a type of creature with no evidence of any past evolutionary ancestry. In other words, they have no similar counterparts in the genomes of other taxon. In fact, orphan genes exist at many levels of taxonomic distance. Notice that, guys. Many levels of taxonomic distance. But that is another story for another time. While creature-specific sets of genes make perfect sense within the creation paradigm, right? It's exactly what we've expected and predicted, that affirms God created everything after its kind. Evolutionists reject the concept of engineered design in biological systems in complete defiance of the evidence, in complete defiance, the willingly ignorant. Remember, in the latter days, there's going to be scoffers that deny three things: the creation. And remember, the creation event explains what we see in the genetics of living organisms. Front-loaded genetic diversity explains what we see. It explains the forward-thinking mechanisms that we find in the information systems of living organisms. But the evolutionists are in defiance. They deny the creation. They deny the global flood, which explains all the geological features of the earth today, and they deny the coming judgment. Therefore, they must come up with naturalistic account of how these cleverly designed DNA sequences were magically generated in very recent evolutionary time. No matter how illogical the reasoning is, they have to have an answer. Remember, they have to. They're not going to question the bigger picture. They can question details of the bigger picture, but not the bigger picture itself. The general idea used to explain the existence of orphan genes involves a completely fictional process devoid of any realistic mechanism called de novo gene synthesis. This is the supposed random, rapid, and magical mutational creation of fully functioning genes from non-coding DNA sequence or massive alterations of protein coding sequence. It would be like taking a chapter from a book, randomly mixing up all the letters, and then producing a completely different legible story replete with proper spelling and grammar. The reasoning or lack thereof regarding the magical production of orphan genes is a circular form of standard evolutionary illogic that goes like this. Orphan genes have no ancestral sequences in other creatures that they evolved from. Therefore, they must have evolved rapidly via de novo gene synthesis, and de novo gene synthesis must be true because orphan genes exist, and orphan genes exist because of de novo gene synthesis. This faulty logic is called circular tautology. Okay, no, de novo gene synthesis doesn't work. Horizontal gene transfer doesn't work. The loss of orphan genes doesn't work. And gene duplication doesn't work. I'm sorry, evolutionists. Okay, so Erica wants to put out this video and just keep repeating this argument that there's no way we can draw a line in ancestry, even though all three of us, me, Matt, logical, plausible, probable, demonstrated that. She is wrong. But these critics keep repeating because they're willingly ignorant. If you don't believe me that they have no answer to this, go watch. We actually put out a video. When was this? About a month ago. I'm looking for it. Okay, 4 weeks ago. Teams, it's doing over a couple thousand views right now. Team Standing for Truth debates Gutsy Gibbons. So have a look at that. But all their best lines of evidence, guys, have been overturned, and they're now evidence for our position of separate ancestry. Notice this on the slide here. All their best lines of evidence. Human chimpanzee genetic identity, they used to say, is 98 to 99%. We now know the actual identity when we consider the entirety of the genomes of humans and chimpanzees, about 88%. Guys, given how slow fixation rates are, okay, 400 million DNA differences, that means human evolution is false. Humans did not evolve from an ape-like ancestor because there's no way in just what the evolutionary time frame allows for, 6 to, let's say, 10 million years. There's no way to fixate. Okay, fixation just means to get stuck in place. There's no way to explain the fixation of all of these DNA differences. that exists between the two species. Humans are genetically closer to apes than any. See, here's the thing. By definition, when God created, and what are the underlying components of our phenotype that makes us us, that makes living organisms life? Well, what? DNA, RNA, proteins, okay? The genotype, the phenotype, and guess what? By definition, we as humans would have to be more similar to some creatures than other creatures. Go to the zoo and tell your 5-year-old to, bring you back or bring you to the creature animal that you look most similar to. Your kid's not going to bring you to an alligator or a fish or a dog. He's going to bring you to like a chimpanzee or a monkey or a gorilla, because by definition, we had to be more similar to some creatures and less similar to others. All right. And it turns out that humans are most similar to the great apes than they are to dogs and fish. So a nested hierarchy is exactly what we'd expect. As you can see here on the slide, relative hierarchies are characteristics of design. Human chromosome number 2 fusion, right? They love that line of evidence. Kenneth Miller loves that line of evidence. Kenneth Miller said, if there was no fusion, there was no evolution. Well, sorry, Kenneth Miller, there was no evolution, because the purported fusion site is actually a functional DNA element inside a human gene. Gene order Sitney, is another line of evidence. Dennis Vanema loves this one. Gene order along chromosomes has no function. Therefore, shared gene order demonstrates common ancestry. But now we know the actual data tells us gene order along chromosomes does indeed perform a function. The pseudogene argument, this whole junk DNA paradigm, all these arguments that come from the junk DNA assumption, it's been overturned. That's why pseudogenes have been overturned. Endogenous retroviruses have been overturned as evidence for universal ancestry, as evidence for human evolution. Pseudogenes appear to be functional DNA elements, not mistakes. Humans possess the broken remnants of an ancient chicken gene. This is a line of evidence that people like Jeannie Scott and Dennis Vanema love, but they've got egg on their face. They got egg on their faces. No such remnant exists. Instead, the fragment appears to be a functional DNA element. We can go on all day, but you know what? For sake of time, I am going to stop there, guys. It's 2022, and it's a great time to be a young Earth creationist. We still got a great chat, still over 40 people here. God bless everybody. I hope everybody enjoyed the show. The evidence definitely suggests separate ancestry. And you know what? That doesn't mean that this is going to stop the critics from repeating the same old talking points, but we are here to refute those talking points. And I think these Q&As are important. So we are going to be doing more of these. So please keep sending in your questions. 2.5 hours really does fly by. And some of these questions are so important, they oftentimes require an entire show to answer and touch on. So guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Tomorrow, we are going to be here at 8 o'clock EST, 7 p.m. Central for another epic evolution-related debate. Kent Hovind versus Matthew Steele. Then we will be here on Thursday with Dr. Dan Biddle. You're not going to want to miss that show with Dr. Dan Biddle. He's going to be doing a must-watch presentation on amazing evidence for the global flood. We'll have an audience Q&A as well. Then the very next day, Beamsy, you have not answered anything. You just lied and used discredited information to support a lie. So, unfortunately, all of that evidence, all of that argumentation went right over this Beamsy's head in one ear and out the other, because this is all based on the most current data, including the pseudogenes. For example, here's a fantastic read that just came out on Evolution News based on new incoming data, more failed predictions for the evolutionists based on pseudogenes. They assume, okay, for example, there's one here. Jeannie Scott confidently asserts that because of mutations, the beta globin pseudogene isn't going to do diddly. It's just going to sit there and not do a thing. She goes on to say this pseudogene is not going to function. It's not going to do anything because it's an inert gene. And guess what? Since humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas share matching mistakes in the pseudogene, they assume that this can only lead to one conclusion, and that is that chimpanzees and humans and gorillas are all related through common ancestry. But this is premature. This is outdated biology, outdated science, because pseudogenes, this idea of shared genetic mistakes proving common ancestry, has been overturned. Humans have 6 copies of the beta globin gene. 5 produce beta globin proteins, but the 6th, the pseudogene copy, has a premature stop codon and other mutations that prevent translation into a protein. In Scott's, this is Jeannie Scott telling, this means that the pseudogene cannot have any function whatsoever. But molecular biology now knows that pseudogenes can produce transcripts, notice this, which can regulate protein coding versions of the same gene. And that's exactly what the researchers propose is going on here. Young Earth creationist researchers? Nope. They compared all 6 genes across humans and chimpanzees and found the beta globin pseudogenes exhibit fewer differences than would be expected if it were non-functional and accumulating random mutations at a constant rate. Notice this, guys. This conserved sequence suggests the beta globin pseudogene has a what? A selectable function. So you evolutionists or theistic evolutionists that want to compromise the Bible, like Joshua Stramidas and William Lane Craig, that want to say humans and chimps are related because of pseudogenes, that's decades ago science, and you are going to continue to have egg on your face more and more every single day. If you are going to compromise the Bible with weak lines of evidence like pseudogenes or ERVs or chromosome 2 fusion or homology, nested hierarchical patterns, you are putting you're putting man before God. Our faith and trust should be in the power of God, not in the power and wisdom of man. The wisdom of man is foolishness to God. And these best so-called arguments for human evolution are being overturned more and more every single day. And these critics, these theistic evolutionists, these naturalistic evolutionists, they are having more and more egg on their face every single day. And it's not looking good. When you have people like William Lane Craig and Biologos and Joshua Stramidas and these Bible compromisers saying, well, human evolution is true because of pseudogenes. And then pseudogenes are overturned as evidence for human evolution because we now know that pseudogenes are necessary for the cell. Okay, which makes sense from our created heterozygosity starting point. We would expect expect a variety of functional DNA elements in the genome of living organisms. That's why there's a hypothesis called the VIGE hypothesis, variation-inducing genetic element hypothesis, where we have things like ERVs and other classes of retrotransposons that are there to help induce variation, to help sustain healthy life processes in the cell, essentially. The conserved sequence, again, egg on their face. This conserved sequence suggests the beta globin pseudogene has a selectable function, making it less tolerant of mutations, what is often called purifying selection. The beta globin pseudogene's inability to produce a translatable RNA transcript does not preclude it from being functional. The researchers argue the pseudogene HBBP1 works something like an on/off switch, regulating, notice this, gene regulation, regulating expression of protein coding beta globin genes. And you can read this very lengthy citation or portion from the paper itself. But there's a lot more to this story. You'll note that they hypothesize function based upon clear genetic evidence and knowledge of how gene regulation operates. Guys, very little of the genome is coding for proteins. Most of the genome is like a giant computer panel with millions and millions of switches regulating every aspect of the gene expression pathway. Right? It's like, picture like a stage performance where you've got the actors and actresses on the stage. Those are the ones you can see. It's like the protein coding genes. But what's going on behind the scenes? You got so much going on behind the scenes that without that which is going on behind the scenes, you wouldn't have the performers, the actors and actresses front and center being able to do what they're doing. You have the producers, the directors, the people controlling the lights, the writers, so on and so forth behind the scenes. And that's what we see with these non-coding areas of our genome, a giant control panel controlling every single aspect of the gene expression pathway. Junk DNA paradigm completely overturned, guys. The precise function of the HBBP1 pseudogene was confirmed and identified in 2020 in a 2021 paper published in Developmental Cell. You guys can check that out. This is a must-read article for sure. And here's the thing: these papers, this information, this data is coming out more and more every single day. And these critics, these evolutionists, especially the theistic evolutionists that want to compromise their Bible with a stupid theory, not even a theory, okay? They're looking bad. It's not looking good for them. In other words, the traditional view that pseudogenes are functionless evolutionary relics has hindered research into understanding the true nature of pseudogenes. But now that we're overcoming that old view, they expect studies elucidating specific functions of pseudogenes to blossom in the future. The implication of this story is that in their rush to oppose intelligent design, Darwin defenders like Eugenie Scott and Ken Miller not only made an argument that has turned out to be completely wrong, it may also have slowed the progress of science. So guys, please check that article out. And I see here, Bleemsy, still no response, still no rebuttal, still no argument. It's a great time to be a biblical creationist in 2021. And we are almost going to be at the 3-hour mark. And since I'm still getting over a cold here and I've kind of lost my voice a little bit, I am going to call it here. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. We've had a ton of great questions. Ton of great responses and answers from Professor David McQueen. We will see everybody here again tomorrow for the much anticipated debate between Matthew Steele and Dr. Kent Hovind. I hope everybody enjoyed. I hope everybody was edified. And again, we will be doing many, many more of these. Guys, you're the life and blood of this channel. You are why we can do full-time research. We've also got a Biblical Creation Basics episode. This one's going to be on genetic entropy, the fact that mutations are accumulating far too quickly and in far too many for selection to do anything about in terms of stopping the genetic degeneration that's going on. We've got episode 7. We'll focus on that. That should be up and good to go in the next several days as well. And yeah, we got a lot going on. So if you want to support us and help us keep putting out content full-time, check us out on Patreon. You can help support us through our official website, standingfortruthministries.com. I appreciate See Science Film Labs. Good to see you, brother. I appreciate the information that you bless us with. You are a warrior. So everybody, thanks for tuning in. We pretty much hit the 3-hour mark. So a lot of data, a lot of information here. Definitely share around this content because, as I always say, the truth is so important. God bless everybody. Standing for Truth is out.